The old bell above the door gave a tired, tinny jingle whenever a customer came in, a sound that always felt more like a sigh than a welcome. For the past 3 years, since my grandfather had passed and left me the shop, that sound had become the metronome of my loneliness. The shop, Heirloom Horology, was a dusty relic itself, smelling of brass polish, old wood, and the faint, sharp scent of cleaning spirits. It was my inheritance and my cage, a place filled with the ghosts of other people's time while my own seemed to have stopped completely. My life was a series of carefully ordered routines designed for survival, not joy. I'd wake up, open the shop, spend the day hunched over a workbench with a loupe pressed to my eye, and close up just after the sun went down. My world had shrunk to the delicate ecosystem of gears, springs, and escapements. I was good at my job. My hands, which often felt clumsy and oversized in the real world, were steady and sure here. I could coax life back into movements that had been silent for a century. It was a quiet, solitary magic, and it was the only thing I had. The stack of unpaid bills on the corner of my desk was a constant, nagging reminder that magic didn't pay the rent. Each jingle of the bell that wasn't followed by a paying customer was another tick of a clock counting down to my failure. I was 28, but I felt ancient, as worn and tired as the timepieces I mended. There was one person in our small town who seemed to understand the value of time, or at least, the value of things that measured it. Julian Croft. He was a local legend, a man who had made his fortune in some quiet, respectable way and retired early to a sprawling stone house on the edge of town. He was a collector, not of art or cars, but of clocks. I'd seen him a few times, a tall, silver-haired man with a stillness about him that was both intimidating and deeply compelling. He moved with a kind of deliberate grace, his presence a quiet anchor in any room he occupied. The town gossiped about him, of course, his wealth, his reclusiveness, but I saw something else. I saw a man who appreciated history, craftsmanship. I saw a kindred spirit, albeit one who lived in a world I could only imagine. I had a small, foolish token of this one-sided connection. A year ago, Mr. Croft had come into the shop to have the leather strap replaced on a simple, elegant wristwatch. He'd been polite, his voice a low, calm baritone that seemed to settle the dust in the air. He had watched my hands as I worked, his gaze focused and intelligent. When I was done, he had paid in cash and left a tip so generous it covered my electricity bill for the month. After he left, I found the old, worn leather strap still on the counter. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I tucked it into a small wooden box in my desk drawer. Sometimes, late at night, I'd take it out and run my thumb over the worn leather, a tangible link to a man who had no idea I even existed beyond a simple transaction. It was a pathetic little secret, a testament to my yearning for a connection I didn't know how to find. The phone rang one Tuesday afternoon, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet ticking of a dozen clocks. I almost didn't answer. It was usually a telemarketer or a creditor, but something made me pick it up. Heirloom Horology, Leo speaking. Mr. Leo Vance. The voice was crisp, professional. Female. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am Mr. Julian Croft's personal assistant. He has asked me to contact you. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up straighter on my stool, my heart starting a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. Yes? How can I help? Mr. Croft has a piece in his collection, a late 18th century grandfather clock, that has stopped working. It's of great sentimental value. He has had 2 other specialists look at it, with no success. He was hoping you might be willing to take a look. This was it. A lifeline. The kind of job that could save the shop, that could give me breathing room for the first time in years. But fear coiled in my stomach. What if I couldn't fix it? What if I failed where others already had? Of course. I managed, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. I'd be happy to. Excellent, she said, a hint of relief in her tone. Mr. Croft understands the complexity of such a piece and insists on a preliminary consultation fee, regardless of whether you take the job. And he would require the work to be done on-site, given the delicate nature of the clock. On-site, in his house. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic and a completely inappropriate flutter of excitement through me. She named a consultation fee that was more than I made in a good week. It was an offer designed to show respect, to remove any sense of obligation. It was a gesture of a man who understood how to use his wealth with grace. That's very generous, I said, my throat tight. When would be a good time? Would tomorrow morning at 10 be suitable? Yes, I said, my mind already racing. 10 o'clock is perfect. We finalized the details, and I hung up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. I stared at the cluttered workbench, at the half-disassembled carriage clock in front of me. For the first time in a long time, the quiet ticking of the shop didn't sound like a countdown to failure. It sounded like a beginning. I opened the drawer of my desk and looked at the worn leather strap in its box. The world suddenly felt a little bigger, a little brighter, filled with the terrifying and exhilarating possibility of a new chapter. The next morning, I spent an hour I didn't have choosing what to wear, finally settling on my least worn pair of dark trousers and a crisp blue shirt. I drove my sputtering, 15-year-old truck up the long, winding drive to the Croft estate, the gravel crunching under the tires like breaking glass. The house wasn't a modern glass palace, as I might have expected. It was an old stone manor, solid and timeless, covered in ivy that had been carefully tended. It looked like it had grown out of the earth, a part of the landscape. It spoke of old money, of history, not of flashy, new wealth. A woman who I assumed was Eleanor, sharp and efficient in a tailored suit, met me at the door and led me through a wide hallway. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of beeswax and old paper. The only sounds were our footsteps on the polished wood floors and the gentle, harmonious ticking of dozens of unseen clocks. It was a symphony of time, and I felt a profound sense of coming home. She led me to a large, book-lined study. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. And there, standing by the fireplace, was Julian Croft. He was taller than I remembered, his silver hair catching the light. He wore simple gray trousers and a soft, cream-colored sweater. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was open. His eyes, a clear, startling blue, were focused entirely on me. There was a weight to his gaze, an assessing quality that saw right through my carefully constructed composure. But it wasn't unkind. It was the look of a man who paid attention. "Mr. Vance," he said. His voice was just as I remembered, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. "Thank you for coming. Please, call me Leo," I said, extending a hand. My palm was sweating. He took my hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm and dry. His hands were what I noticed most. They were large, with long, capable fingers. There were fine lines around his knuckles, the skin showing the faint tracery of age, but they were the hands of a man who was not afraid of work. He held my hand for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, his thumb pressing lightly against my pulse point before he released me. The brief contact sent a jolt up my arm. "Julian, then," he said, his gaze unwavering. "This is the patient." He gestured to the corner of the room, and I saw it. My breath hitched. It was a masterpiece, nearly 9 feet tall, carved from dark, rich mahogany, with a face of painted porcelain depicting a serene moon and a fleet of sailing ships. It was exquisite, a work of art that just happened to also tell time. And it was silent. Its stillness felt like a tragedy. "She stopped 3 weeks ago," Julian said, his voice softer now, tinged with a genuine sadness. "Just fell silent one evening. Her name is the Alnwick." I approached it slowly, reverently. I ran my fingers lightly over the cool, smooth wood of the case. I could feel the faintest vibration of dormant potential within it. This was more than a machine, it was a legacy. "May I?" I asked, looking back at him. He gave a single, permissive nod. "Please, do whatever you need to." I opened the delicate glass door and peered inside. The brass weights were hung, the pendulum still. My world narrowed to this silent, beautiful object. Julian Croft, his magnificent house, my own anxieties, they all faded away, replaced by the familiar language of gears and levers. I spent the next hour in silent, focused examination, my mind tracing the intricate pathways of the movement, searching for the source of the silence. Julian didn't interrupt. He simply moved to a large leather armchair by the window and sat, watching me. I was acutely aware of his presence, of the quiet weight of his attention. It wasn't pressure. It felt like respect, like he was giving me the space I needed to work my quiet magic. The work on the Alnwick took on a rhythm of its own. Each morning, I would drive up to the estate, and Eleanor would let me in with a polite, professional nod. I'd make my way to the study, where Julian would often already be, sitting in his armchair with a book or a stack of papers. He'd greet me with a quiet, "Good morning, Leo," and the rich, dark aroma of freshly brewed coffee would be waiting for me in a porcelain cup on a small table beside my workspace. The first time it happened, I was flustered, murmuring my thanks, feeling like an intruder being waited on. But his response was simple. "It's no trouble. I enjoy it." After that, it became part of our silent ritual. I spent those days in a state of heightened awareness. My focus was on the clock, on the delicate dance of its internal mechanisms, but a part of my consciousness was always tuned to him. I learned the soft rustle of him turning a page, the quiet sigh he'd let out when he was deep in thought, the faint, clean scent of his cologne, something subtle, like sandalwood and bergamot, that clung to the air in the room. He never hovered, never questioned my methods. He simply existed in the space with me, a steady, grounding presence. Sometimes, hours would pass in near total silence, broken only by the scrape of my tools and the ticking of the other clocks in the house. It was a comfortable silence, not an awkward one. It felt companionable, as if we were two craftsmen working side by side at our respective trades. I was mending time, and I wasn't sure what he was doing. Reading financial reports, perhaps, or corresponding with other collectors. But the work seemed to absorb him in the same way the clock absorbed me. I found myself watching him in small, stolen moments. I'd look up from a particularly tricky gear and see the way the sunlight from the window caught the silver in his hair. I'd notice the focused line of his brow as he read, the way his mouth would curve in a faint, almost imperceptible smile at something on the page. He was, I realized with a jolt that was both terrifying and thrilling, a profoundly beautiful man. Not in the polished, perfect way of a magazine model, but in a deeper, more resonant way. His face was a map of his life, etched with lines of thought and experience. There was a kindness in his eyes, but also a formidable intelligence. He was a man who had built his own world and was now content to live quietly within it. My internal monologue was a relentless cycle of analysis and second-guessing. That coffee he made me, was it just the polite gesture of a good host? Or was it something more? He was paying me handsomely for my time. He didn't owe me any extra kindness. When he asked a question about the clock's escapement, his interest seemed genuine, not feigned. He listened, really listened, to my explanation, his blue eyes fixed on mine. I found myself wanting to impress him, not just with my skill, but with my passion. I wanted him to see that I understood these machines not just as objects of value, but as vessels of history and artistry. My grandfather taught me. I told him one afternoon, without meaning to. The words just came out. I was holding a tiny, intricate palette fork up to the light. He looked up from his book, his full attention on me. "He owned the shop before you, then?" "Yes," I said, my throat feeling a little tight. Heirloom horology was his life. He used to say that a clockmaker doesn't just fix clocks, he fixes time for people. He restores their connection to the past. Julian was silent for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," I said, a wave of grief and affection washing over me. "He would have loved this clock." "He would have," Julian agreed softly. And in that moment, the distance between us, the vast gulf of age, wealth, and experience, seemed to shrink just a little. We were just two men in a quiet room, talking about our grandfathers. The first time he touched me, it was so brief, so incidental, I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I was reaching for a small pair of tweezers that had rolled just out of my reach on the workbench. At the exact same moment, Julian, who had stood up to stretch his legs, reached for them too. His fingers brushed against the back of my hand. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But his skin was warm, and a shock of electricity, sharp and undeniable, shot up my arm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. "Sorry," I mumbled, my face flushing hot. "My apologies," he said, his voice perfectly even. He picked up the tweezers and handed them to me, his fingers carefully avoiding mine this time. But his eyes held mine for a beat too long, and I saw a flicker of something in their blue depths. Surprise? Recognition? I couldn't be sure. The moment passed. He went back to his chair, I went back to the clock. But the feeling of his touch lingered on my skin for the rest of the day, a phantom warmth that I couldn't shake. I replayed the moment over and over in my head. It was an accident. It had to be. A man like Julian Croft wouldn't be interested in someone like me. I was the hired help, a temporary fixture in his perfectly curated world. To imagine anything else was pure fantasy, a dangerous delusion born of my own loneliness. But a few days later, it happened again. I was trying to reseat a heavy brass weight, the chain slipping through my fingers. It was an awkward angle, requiring me to lean deep into the clock's case. "Do you need a hand with that?" Julian's voice came from directly behind me. I hadn't even heard him get up. I startled, my elbow bumping against the side of the case. "I've almost got it," I said, my voice strained with effort. "Let me," he said, and before I could protest, he was there, his body close behind mine, his arm reaching past me into the case. The warmth of him was a solid presence at my back. I could smell that faint, clean scent of his cologne again, this time mixed with the simple, warm scent of his skin. I held my breath, my entire body rigid. His large, capable hand closed over the weight easily. "Tell me where you need it," he said, his voice a low murmur near my ear. My mind went blank for a second. I could feel the heat radiating from his chest, could almost feel the rhythm of his breathing. I forced myself to focus. Just up a little, and to the left. "It needs to catch on the hook there." We moved together, a slow, careful choreography in the narrow space. His arm brushed against my shoulder. I could feel the solid muscle beneath his sweater. When the weight was securely in place, he didn't immediately pull back. For a long, suspended moment, he just stayed there, his hand resting on the weight, his body a warm shield behind me. Then he leaned back, breaking the contact. "There we go," he said, his voice as calm as ever. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and slowly straightened up, turning to face him. My heart was hammering against my ribs. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Of course," he replied. There was a small, unreadable smile playing on his lips. "Teamwork." He returned to his chair, and the room was silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer just comfortable, it was charged, filled with unspoken things. I tried to focus on the clock, but my hands were trembling. That touch hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberate, gentle, respectful, but deliberate, and it had felt less like a helping hand and more like a question being asked, one I had no idea how to answer. The breakthrough came on a rainy Friday afternoon. The sky outside was a bruised purple, and the sound of the rain drumming against the tall windows filled the study, creating a cozy, insular world for just the two of us. I had finally identified the core problem in the Alnwick. A single tooth on a crucial gear in the strike train had been sheared off, so small a flaw that it was almost invisible to the naked eye. It was a delicate repair, one that would require fabricating a new tooth and grafting it onto the gear, a procedure akin to microsurgery. "I found it," I announced, a note of triumph in my voice. I held the small brass gear in my palm for him to see. Julian set his book aside and came over to the workbench, leaning in close to inspect the minuscule flaw. He was standing beside me, our shoulders almost touching. The rainy day light softened the lines on his face, making him look younger, more approachable. "Incredible," he said, his voice full of genuine admiration. "That you could even spot that." "It's what I do," I said, feeling a flush of pride. "But fixing it, it's going to be tricky. I'll need to take this piece back to my shop. I have the tools there." "Of course," he said. "Take as much time as you need." He paused, his gaze shifting from the gear in my hand to my face. "You truly have a gift, Leo." The simple, direct praise made my chest feel tight. No one had ever called my work a gift before. A trade, a skill, a job, but never a gift. "Thank you," I managed. We stood there for a moment in the quiet, rain-soaked room. I should have packed up the gear and made my exit, but I was rooted to the spot, caught in the quiet intensity of his gaze. "I'll have it back by Monday," I said, just to break the silence. "There's no rush," he said softly. Then, he did something that completely disarmed me. He asked a question that had nothing to do with the clock. Is it doing all right?" The question was so unexpected, so personal, that I didn't have my usual defenses up. The truth tumbled out before I could stop it. "It's a struggle," I admitted, my eyes dropping to the workbench. "My grandfather left some debts. People don't value old things the way they used to. They'd rather buy something new than repair something with history. I immediately regretted the admission. It felt like a plea for pity, a weakness I hadn't wanted to expose, especially not to him. But when I dared to look up, there was no pity in his eyes. There was only a deep, thoughtful empathy. "That's a shame," he said, his voice low. "Because things with history have the most soul." He looked around the room, at the books, the furniture, the silent clock. "This house can feel very empty sometimes. Full of beautiful, soulless things." He looked back at me. "You've brought a different kind of life into it this past week. It's been welcome." My heart did a slow, painful flip in my chest. This was it. This was the moment where the careful, professional boundary between us dissolved. He was no longer just a client, and I was no longer just the clockmaker. He was sharing a piece of his own loneliness with me, a quiet admission of vulnerability that mirrored my own. I've enjoyed being here," I confessed, my voice barely audible over the rain. "It's quiet, peaceful." "I'm glad," he said. He took a small step closer, and my breath hitched. He seemed about to say something else, something important, when the soft chime of the telephone on his desk interrupted the moment. He glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features, before he moved to answer it. The spell was broken. I quickly and carefully wrapped the small gear in a velvet cloth and placed it in my tool case. "I'll see you on Monday then," I said, my voice louder than necessary. Julian was speaking in low tones on the phone, but he looked up at me and nodded, a look of genuine regret in his eyes. I gave him a small, tight smile and left the room, my mind reeling. As I walked down the long hall, the harmonious ticking of his collection seemed to mock me. He had opened a door, just a crack, and shown me a glimpse of the man behind the wealthy, reclusive facade. And I realized, with a terrifying certainty, that I was already halfway through that door, and I had no idea how to turn back. The weekend was a form of exquisite torture. I spent all of Saturday at my workbench, my hands steady as I performed the delicate surgery on the tiny brass gear. My shop, usually a sanctuary, felt small and shabby. The solitude I had once found comforting now felt like a crushing weight. I kept replaying that moment in the study, his quiet confession, the warmth in his eyes. I was falling, and falling hard, for a man who lived in a different universe. I told myself it was hopeless, a schoolboy crush on a kind, older man who was probably just being polite. But my heart refused to listen. On Monday morning, I drove back up the gravel drive with the repaired gear nestled safely in a padded box on the passenger seat. My stomach was a knot of nerves. I felt as if I were heading to a final exam for which I hadn't studied. When Eleanor let me in, she gave me a slightly warmer smile than usual. "Mr. Croft is in the study," she said. "He's been looking forward to your return." The words sent a ridiculous surge of hope through me. I found him not in his usual armchair, but standing before the Alnwick, his hand resting gently on its wooden case, as if willing it to life. He turned as I entered, and a genuine, unguarded smile lit up his face. It transformed him, erasing years and erasing the last of my resolve. "Leo," he said, "welcome back." "I have it," I said, holding up the small box like an offering. "The repair went well. It should work perfectly now." The next hour was a blur of intense focus. I reassembled the strike train, my fingers moving with a sureness that belied the tremor in my soul. Julian stood beside me the entire time, watching, his presence a silent, supportive weight. He handed me tools before I asked for them, his perception so attuned to my process that it felt like we were working with one mind. The intimacy of it was more potent than any touch. Finally, it was done. All that was left was to start the pendulum. I looked at him, my heart in my throat. "This is it." He nodded, his eyes bright with anticipation. I reached into the case and gently pulled the heavy brass pendulum to one side. I held it there for a beat, the silence in the room stretching taut. Then I let it go. It swung away from my hand, a silent, graceful arc tick. It swung back. Talk. The sound was deep and resonant, a slow, steady heartbeat filling the room. It was alive. We both let out a breath we'd been holding. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. "The chime," he whispered. "We have to wait for the chime." We stood side by side, watching the long minute hand creep its way toward the hour. The ticking was the only sound, a countdown to the moment of truth. My shoulder was a mere inch from his. I could feel the warmth of his body, could see the tiny pulse beating in the side of his neck. The air was electric. The hand reached the 12. There was a faint whirring sound from within the case, the sound of machinery gathering its strength. And then it happened. A single, clear, beautiful note rang out, echoing through the study. Then another, and another, until it had chimed 10 times. The sound was rich and full. A voice returned from a long slumber. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was different. It was a peaceful silence, a contented one. The Alnwick was whole again. "You did it," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to face me, his blue eyes shining. "I never thought I'd hear that sound again. I'm glad I could fix it for you," I said, my own voice unsteady. "You've done more than that," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "You've brought life back into this house." He took a step closer, closing the small gap between us. My breath caught. This was it. The precipice. He looked down at my hands, which were resting on the workbench, still smudged with a bit of oil. He reached out, not for my hand, but for my wrist. His fingers wrapped around it gently, his thumb coming to rest directly over my pulse, which was now racing like a runaway clock. The contact was electric, a current that shot straight to my core. He held my wrist, his gaze locked on mine. "All this time," he said softly, his thumb stroking my skin, "I've collected things that measure time. But I've just been watching it pass. You don't just watch it. You hold it in your hands. You mend it." He lifted my hand slightly, his grip still gentle but firm. The grandfather clock behind him let out another steady, reassuring tick. Julian looked from my eyes to the clock and then back again. A slow, meaningful smile touched his lips. "Time's ours," he said. The words hung in the air, a promise and a declaration. It wasn't a claim of ownership, but an invitation, an offer of a shared future. My mind stopped its frantic spinning, and a profound sense of calm washed over me. This was real. This was happening. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I met him halfway. His lips were soft, warm, and hesitant at first, a question. I answered by leaning into him, my free hand coming up to rest on his chest, where I could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. The kiss deepened, and it was nothing like I had ever imagined. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, resonant feeling. It was slow and sure and unhurried. It tasted of coffee and relief and 100 unspoken conversations. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't known I was searching for. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His hand was still warm around my wrist. My own hand was still flat against his chest. I could feel the fine wool of his sweater, the solid strength beneath it. The Alnwick ticked steadily on, marking the first seconds of our new time. "Leo," he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper. "Julian," I answered, the name feeling solid and right on my tongue. There were 1,000 things to say, 1,000 questions to ask about what this meant, about the chasm between our worlds. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the steady warmth of his hand, the solid presence of his body, and the quiet, irrefutable truth that something had just begun. The clock was fixed, and maybe, just maybe, so was I. I stayed, not in his bed, but in a guest room down the hall, a beautiful, understated space with a large window that looked out over the darkened gardens. The decision was unspoken, a mutual understanding that what had just happened was too important to rush, too fragile to be pushed into something it wasn't ready for. Julian had walked me to the door of the room, his hand warm on the small of my back. "Rest well, Leo," he'd said, his voice still holding a trace of wonder. He hadn't tried to kiss me again, but the look in his eyes had been more intimate than any touch. I didn't sleep much. I lay awake under the cool, smooth sheets, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the old house settling. The ticking of the Alnwick was a faint, comforting heartbeat from downstairs. But as the hours passed, the initial euphoria began to fade, replaced by a creeping unease. In the stark, lonely quiet of the night, the realities of our situation came crashing down on me. He was Julian Croft, a man of immense wealth, taste, and quiet power. And I was Leo Vance, the town clockmaker, drowning in my grandfather's debt, with nothing to my name but a failing shop and a pair of skilled hands. The kiss had felt like a meeting of equals, two lonely souls finding each other. But what about tomorrow? What about the day after? The morning light would reveal the truth. He was the patron, and I was the tradesman. The power imbalance was a vast, undeniable chasm between us. I was terrified of becoming a project, a curiosity, a kept man whose only value was his novelty. The thought sent a cold dread seeping into my bones. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, I was already dressed. I crept downstairs, my shoes silent on the thick runners in the hall. I just needed to leave, to get back to my own small, manageable world before I got in any deeper, before my heart could get any more broken than it already felt. I found him in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter, wearing a simple gray t-shirt and dark trousers, pouring hot water into a French press. He wasn't a man waited on by staff. He made his own coffee. The simple, domestic act was so at odds with my late-night fears that I stopped in the doorway, momentarily stunned. He must have heard me, because he turned, a coffee mug in his hand. The smile on his face was gentle, but it faltered slightly when he saw the tension in my posture, the tool case I was holding like a shield. His eyes, so full of warmth last night, were now clouded with a flicker of concern, of understanding. He saw my fear before I even spoke a word. "Good morning," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't ask if I was leaving. He just gestured to the counter. "Coffee." I hesitated, then gave a stiff nod, setting my case down by the door. "Thank you." He poured a second mug and pushed it across the smooth stone countertop toward me. He didn't press, didn't crowd me. He gave me space, leaning back against the counter and sipping his own coffee, waiting. The silence stretched, filled only by the gurgle of the coffee maker and my own hammering heart. "Julian," I began, my voice rough. "Last night was—" "It was," he interrupted softly, his gaze steady and direct, long overdue. For me, at least. His honesty disarmed me. I can't," I stammered, feeling foolish and young. "We're from different worlds. I can't be. I don't want to be someone who depends on you." He listened, his expression unchanging. There was no judgment, no denial. He just let me speak my fear aloud. When I was finished, he set his mug down with a soft click. "I would never want you to be," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Leo, your independence is part of who you are. Your skill, your passion for your work. That's what I first saw in you. That's what I admire. The thought of diminishing that in any way is abhorrent to me." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I have resources. That's a fact. It's a tool, like any other. It can be used to build things or to trap them. I have no interest in trapping you. I do, however, have a great deal of interest in building something with you, if you're willing." He picked up a thick envelope from the counter and slid it toward me. My stomach clenched. "A payoff? A severance?" "This isn't what you think it is," he said, seeming to read my mind. "Open it." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. Inside was not a check made out to me, but a detailed contract. It was a proposal. He wanted to hire me, officially, as the curator and caretaker of his entire collection. It offered a generous monthly retainer, enough to clear my debts and keep the shop running comfortably, in exchange for a set number of hours per week dedicated to maintaining his clocks. The terms were professional, clear, and respectful. It gave me financial security, but it was a salary for a job I was uniquely qualified for. It preserved my dignity, my agency. "The shop remains yours," he said, his eyes never leaving my face. "Your time remains yours. This is a professional arrangement. It ensures we have a reason to see each other that is clear and defined. And it takes the issue of money off the table, so that anything else, anything that grows between us, can do so on its own terms. Separate from this." I stared at the contract, a wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy washing over me. He had anticipated my fears. He had thought it through and found a practical, respectful solution. He wasn't trying to buy me or save me. He was trying to meet me, to build a bridge across the chasm I had been so afraid of. "This is," I started, my voice choked with emotion. "This is more than fair. Is it something you can agree to?" he asked, a genuine question. I looked up from the papers and met his gaze. I saw not a wealthy collector, but a man who was offering me a partnership in every sense of the word. A man who was just as vulnerable, just as hopeful, as I was. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and steady for the first time that morning. I can agree to that. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a smile of pure relief. Good, he said softly. In that case, would you be willing to stay for breakfast? I make terrible pancakes, but the coffee is excellent. The tension in the room evaporated, replaced by a warm, hopeful light. I smiled back, a real smile this time. I'd like that very much. We spent the next few weeks navigating the new terrain of our relationship, both professional and personal. The contract gave us a structure, a safe foundation from which to build. During my official work hours, we were curator and client. I would move through the house, tending to his magnificent collection, and he would give me my space, though I was always aware of his presence, a quiet hum in the background of my day. We talked about clocks, about history, about craftsmanship. It was easy, comfortable. But when the workday was done, the dynamic would shift. He'd ask me to stay for dinner. We'd eat in the large, formal dining room, the space feeling less intimidating with him sitting across from me, his eyes warm in the candlelight. We talked about everything and nothing, books we'd read, places we'd traveled, or in my case, places I dreamed of traveling, our families, our pasts. He was a patient, attentive listener, drawing me out of my shell with gentle questions. And he shared pieces of himself, too. The pressures of his former career, the loneliness that had settled in after he retired, his quiet joy in his collection. Our first real test came about a month in. A local historical society was hosting a fundraising gala, and Julian was a primary sponsor. He asked me to accompany him. Not as his employee, he made that very clear, but as his date. The word hung in the air between us, thrilling and terrifying. I said yes. I spent a week's worth of my new salary on a well-fitting suit. Standing in front of the mirror, I felt like an imposter, a boy playing dress-up. When Julian picked me up from my small apartment above the shop, he looked impossibly handsome in a dark tuxedo. He didn't say anything about my shabby surroundings. He just smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You look wonderful, Leo. The gala was held in a grand, historic ballroom. It was a world of champagne, quiet murmurs, and calculating glances. I felt every single one of those glances on me. I saw the whispers behind cupped hands, the curious looks directed at Julian, then at me, who was the young man with the town's most eligible and reclusive bachelor. My old insecurities came rushing back. I felt gawky, out of place. I was just the help, brought along for the evening. I must have tensed, because Julian, who was standing beside me, subtly moved closer and placed a hand on the small of my back. The touch was a firm, reassuring pressure. A silent message. I am here. You are with me. The real challenge came in the form of a man named Marcus Thorne, a slick, self-satisfied real estate developer who clearly saw Julian as a rival. Julian, Thorne boomed, clapping Julian on the shoulder. Good to see you out and about. And who is this? His eyes swept over me, a dismissive, appraising look that made my skin crawl. Marcus, Julian said, his voice level and cool. This is Leo Vance, my partner. The word hung in the air, unambiguous and solid. Thorne's eyebrows shot up. He looked from Julian to me and back again, a smirk playing on his lips. Vance. Vance, the clockmaker, right? He said, his tone condescending. Fixing Julian's tickers, are you? Must be a delicate touch you've got. The innuendo was vile, and I felt my face flush with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Before I could even think of a response, Julian stepped slightly in front of me, a subtle, protective movement. Leo is a master horologist, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register that was quiet but carried an unmistakable edge of steel. His talent for restoring things of beauty and value is unparalleled. You, of all people, should appreciate that, Marcus, given your talent for tearing them down. The verbal slap was so swift, so precise, that Thorne was left speechless for a moment. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. He mumbled something about needing to find his wife and made a hasty retreat. Julian turned to me, his expression softening. Are you all right? I could only nod, my throat tight. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. He had simply defended me. Defended us. He had called me his partner in front of everyone, without hesitation. He had claimed me, not as a possession, but as an equal. In that moment, standing in that glittering, hostile room, I had never felt safer. He led me out onto a quiet terrace overlooking the gardens. The cool night air was a relief. We stood in silence for a few moments, watching the stars. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quiet. "There is nothing to thank me for," he said, turning to face me. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. "I will not allow anyone to disrespect you, Leo. Ever." He lifted my hand and pressed a soft, warm kiss to my knuckles. It was a gesture that felt both courtly and deeply intimate. I looked at our joined hands, his, larger and marked by time, mine, younger and smudged with the faint memory of oil and brass. They fit together perfectly. The gossip, the whispers, the judgment of the outside world, none of it mattered. What mattered was here, on this quiet terrace, between us. We were building our own world, a world with its own time, its own rules. And for the first time, I felt strong enough to live in it. The gala marked a turning point. After that night, something settled between us. The last of my doubts, the lingering fear of the power imbalance, seemed to burn away under the steady warmth of his regard. He had proven, not with money, but with his actions, that he saw me as his equal. My trust in him became absolute. Our life together found its own quiet rhythm, a comfortable cadence that felt as natural and steady as the ticking of a well-made clock. The professional and the personal began to blur in the most wonderful way. I still kept my shop, a place that was mine, a symbol of my independence. But more and more, I found myself spending my evenings, and then my nights, at his house. The guest room I had first stayed in was soon forgotten. His house, once a silent, intimidating museum, slowly became a home. My toothbrush appeared in his bathroom. A few of my books found their way onto his nightstand. I started leaving a change of clothes in the closet of his spacious bedroom. Each new step toward domesticity was a quiet, mutual decision. One evening, as I was packing my bag to go home, he simply said, "Don't." His voice was soft. "Stay? This is your home too, if you want it to be." And I knew that I did. He gave me a key, not as a grand gesture, but on a Tuesday morning, as I was heading out to open the shop. He pressed it into my palm, his fingers closing over mine for a moment. "So you don't have to wait for Eleanor to let you in anymore," he said, as if it were the most practical, logical thing in the world. But we both knew what it meant. It was a key to the house, but it was also a key to his life. An invitation to come and go as one of its inhabitants, not as a visitor. We learned each other's habits, the small, intimate details that make up a shared life. I learned that he was an early riser, that he liked his coffee black, and that he had a surprising fondness for old, black and white mystery films. He learned that I couldn't sleep without the window cracked open, even in winter, and that I hummed, slightly off-key, when I was deeply focused on a delicate repair. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of something burning. I rushed downstairs to find Julian standing in a cloud of smoke, frowning at a blackened lump in a frying pan. He looked up at me, a dusting of flour on his nose, and a sheepish grin spread across his face. "I was attempting to recreate the pancakes from that diner you like," he said, gesturing at the mess with a spatula. "I believe I have failed." I started to laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that filled the large, sunlit kitchen. He looked at me, and his own smile widened. In that moment, he wasn't the formidable Julian Croft, the wealthy collector. He was just a man, covered in flour, who had tried to do something nice for the person he cared about and failed spectacularly. It was the most endearing thing I had ever seen. "Here," I said, taking the spatula from his hand. "Let me show you." We spent the next hour making breakfast together. I showed him how to mix the batter without overworking it, how to tell when the griddle was the perfect temperature. He was a surprisingly good student, his movements precise and careful. We moved around each other in the easy, familiar dance of a long-established couple, my arm brushing his as I reached for the milk, his hand resting on my waist as he looked over my shoulder. We ate our slightly less burnt pancakes sitting at the kitchen island, our knees touching, the morning sun streaming in. The grandfather clock chimed 9 from the study, its clear notes a soundtrack to our quiet, perfect morning. This, I thought, was what it felt like to be home. It wasn't the grand house or the priceless collection. It was this, the easy silence, the shared laughter, the simple intimacy of making breakfast together. It was the feeling of being completely, utterly seen and accepted for exactly who I was. A few months later, on a cool autumn evening, we were sitting in the study. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. I was on the floor, cleaning and oiling a small French mantel clock from his collection, while Julian sat in his armchair, reading. The Alnwick stood silent sentinel in the corner, its steady tick-tock a comforting presence. I finished my work and sat back on my heels, watching the fire. I felt a profound sense of peace, a contentment so deep it felt like it had settled right into my bones. All the fear and uncertainty that had plagued me for so long had vanished, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence. Julian set his book down. He had been watching me, a soft, fond expression on his face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I looked at him, at the man who had so carefully and patiently dismantled the walls I had built around my heart. I thought about the dusty, lonely shop and the man I used to be, a man who thought his time was running out. "I was thinking about time," I said. "I used to feel like I was always fighting it, trying to catch up, trying to hold on to the past. But I'm not afraid of it anymore." I looked around the room, at the fire, at the sleeping clocks, at the man I loved. "It feels different now, with you." He stood up and came to me, sinking down to sit on the floor beside me. He took my hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The firelight danced in his eyes. "How does it feel?" he asked softly. I thought for a moment, searching for the right words. I looked at our joined hands, then into his eyes. "It feels like it's ours." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. He leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that was full of warmth and promise and the steady, comforting rhythm of a shared future. It was a kiss that said we had all the time in the world because we would make it together. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour, its sweet, clear notes marking not the passage of time, but the beginning of it. Our beginning. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.